A deep analysis of love and human psychology conducted by Carl Jung helps us understand the fundamental dynamics of relationships. In this video, we will talk about the reasons why people fall in love with you from Carl Jung's point of view. According to Carl Jung, people fall in love for two main reasons. One, to compensate for their own shortcomings, the mechanism of projection, and your desires, familiar archetypes, and subconscious modeling. First, let's explain the first reason. The first, compensating for one's own shortcomings, the mechanism of projection. We will examine this primary reason in 4 sections. 1.1. The first reflection of the shadow. In Carl Jung's psychology, the shadow represents those aspects of a person's personality that are pushed into the subconscious, difficult to accept, or repressed. By nature, humans strive to feel whole and balanced. However, the traits that are lacking in a person's character, or that they subconsciously reject, create a strong attraction when they appear in others in the external world. This is where love comes into play. The person we fall in love with may, in fact, be a reflection of those aspects of ourselves that we consciously do not recognize or are unaware of. This is why sudden and intense interest in someone often arises not because of their actual qualities, but because our unconscious shadow parts resonate with something in the outside world. The mechanism of shadow projection makes a person see their own flaws in others. For example, an introvert who feels uncomfortable in social situations may fall in love with an extrovert, someone energetic and self-assured. In reality, this love is the result of admiration and longing for those aspects of the self that exist in the subconscious, but which the person doesn't dare to express. Within the unconscious of the individual lie the character traits of the person they fall in love with, but because they cannot develop or have repressed these traits, they seek them in the external world. This happens as an expression of the human desire to feel whole. Thus, love can be a reflection of a person's drive for self-improvement. However, this realization doesn't always bring a positive effect. Sometimes a person may project onto another the negative aspects of themselves that they have repressed and refused to accept. At the beginning of love, the projection mechanism works intensely, and the person sees the other as a magical being. The one they fall in love with appears, in their eyes, to be ideal, whole, and extraordinary. However, over time, disappointment can arise as this projected shadow fades and the real person is revealed because the individual can no longer attempt to fulfill the missing aspects of their subconscious through their partner. It is at this moment that the relationship either evolves into a deeper connection or begins to fall apart. True love begins when projection ends and the partner is accepted for who they really are. One of the greatest mechanisms of love is the reflection of the shadow. A person turns to others to compensate for the missing or repressed aspects within themselves and often finds a reflection of their own subconscious in the person they fall in love with. However, love experienced without reaching this awareness often remains superficial and may eventually lead to disappointment. Jung's approach helps us understand love not just as an emotional experience, but as a profound psychological process. If a person wants to understand why they fall in love, whom they choose, and why, they must first recognize their own shadow and bring it into consciousness. Because true love begins where projection ends. Anima and animus projection. One of the most important concepts of love developed by Carl Jung is the idea of the anima and animus, which represent the spiritual reflection of the opposite sex that a person carries within themselves. According to Jung, every man carries within his unconscious a feminine side, the anima, while every woman carries within her unconscious a masculine side, the animus. This is a universal part of human psychology and plays a major role in shaping romantic love. People feel an unconscious attraction to those whose characteristics correspond to their inner anima or animus, often without realizing it. This attraction, which lies at the core of love, is in fact a striving for inner wholeness. The anima embodies the feminine aspect of the male psyche. According to Jung, when a man cannot fully accept the feminine emotions and intuition he carries within, he creates a powerful image of the anima in his subconscious. This image is often based on the figure of the mother in early childhood and eventually shapes his perception of women. If a man had a caring, understanding, and compassionate mother, he may be attracted throughout his life to women with those qualities. However, if his mother was cold, distant, or critical, he may subconsciously feel drawn to women with similar traits. In reality, he seeks in a romantic partner the unresolved emotional dynamics he experienced with his mother and unconsciously recreates those patterns in his relationships. Similarly, the animus is the unconscious masculine aspect within women, and it shapes how they perceive men. The animus in a woman's subconscious is often a reflection of her father or other influential male figures from childhood. If a woman grew up with a strong, authoritative, and nurturing father figure, she may be attracted to men with similar qualities. On the other hand, if her father was emotionally distant or indifferent, she may find herself drawn to emotionally unavailable men. This happens because the animus in the subconscious attempts to compensate for the aspects lacking in the person's inner world. The projection of the anima and animus plays a major role in relationships. Sometimes it means that a person sees the one they fall in love with through these internal projections, rather than seeing them for who they truly are. When a man falls in love with a woman, what often attracts him is her alignment with his unconscious image of the anima, not her physical or personality traits. The same applies to a woman falling in love with someone who matches her inner animus. This is why people often have a type and feel subconsciously drawn to those with certain recurring traits. The core reason behind this is the image of the ideal partner, which has been formed unconsciously by the anima or animus within. However, this projection does not always lead to healthy outcomes. A person may idealize their partner and assign them qualities they do not actually possess. According to Jung, true love only begins when the projection of the anima and animus ends. A person can build a healthy relationship when they are able to accept the other as they truly are, rather than trying to compensate for their own unconscious deficiencies through their partner. Otherwise, love becomes an illusion and can lead to disappointment as the relationship develops. To understand why people fall in love with certain individuals, they must first explore the concepts of anima and animus within their own inner world. Only when this awareness is reached can love stop being a search for completeness and become a connection in which two people truly accept one another. It's the search for completion of unfinished psychological development. Human psychology is, by nature, in a constant search for growth and improvement. According to Carl Jung, the personality is shaped by various experiences beginning in childhood, and some psychological aspects may not fully develop during this process. These missing aspects create a void in a person's inner world, and the desire to fill that void is often reflected in romantic relationships. People unconsciously fall in love with someone who complements the traits they perceive as lacking or weak within themselves. Love is not merely an emotional bond, but also an attempt to heal psychological deficiencies on a subconscious level. In order to complete their unfinished psychological development, a person unconsciously chooses a partner who embodies those missing aspects or offers the opportunity to develop them. For example, a person who experienced emotional neglect at a young age may fall in love with someone who shows them great attention and constant affection. However, this type of love can turn into dependence, aimed at satisfying a need that was unmet in childhood, rather than becoming a healthy emotional connection. The individual becomes attached to their partner not only out of love, but also out of an expectation of psychological fulfillment. This can lead to imbalance in the relationship, as love begins to function as a kind of therapeutic process. Some individuals may have been raised by overprotective parents in childhood. Because they were not able to fully develop their independence, they are drawn in life to strong and self-sufficient individuals who they feel can liberate them. A person who struggles to make decisions on their own or lacks self-confidence may fall in love with someone who is decisive and bold, because they subconsciously feel that this person will guide them and compensate for their deficiencies. However, there is also a risk here. If the person becomes entirely dependent on their partner, the relationship can lead to a loss of individuality rather than a healthy developmental process. The desire to complete unfinished psychological development is not limited to emotional aspects, it also includes missing elements of the person's personality structure. For example, someone who lacks discipline and order may be attracted to a person who lives in a structured and organized way. A person who finds it difficult to express emotions may fall in love with someone who expresses their feelings openly and freely. Although such relationships may initially seem harmonious, over time they can result in one person becoming completely reliant on the other, rather than working to correct their own shortcomings. True psychological growth, however, is possible when a person completes their own development while receiving support from their partner. According to Jung, psychological development is a lifelong process, and love is one of its most important catalysts. True love is a process in which we grow together with our partner, becoming aware of and working through our own flaws, rather than expecting our partner to complete us. One reason people fall in love is the inner drive to complete their unfinished psychological development. Deficiencies, repressed emotions, and underdeveloped aspects stemming from childhood shape romantic relationships on a subconscious level. However, true psychological maturity is only possible when an individual reaches this development within their own inner world, rather than attempting to fulfill those gaps through someone else. From Jung's perspective, love is not only an emotional connection, it is also a mirror that helps a person complete their psychological development. If we can consciously experience love in this way, it can become not merely a dependency born from need, but a deep and meaningful experience that helps the individual fulfill their true potential. Kanche, idealization, and the pursuit of perfection. According to Carl Jung's psychological theory, people often perceive love as a process of idealization aimed at compensating for the missing or incomplete aspects of their unconscious. In this process, the person one falls in love with is not seen as they truly are, but rather as an idealized image created in the mind of the individual. People often unconsciously begin to see the person they are in love with as perfect, flawless, and complementary. This is a reflection of inner desires, aspirations, and an unconscious need for fulfillment. However, over time, such idealization can create illusions about the nature of love and lead to serious disappointments in later stages of a relationship. The mechanism of idealization is especially strong during the early stages of love. A person tends to perceive their partner as extraordinary and either overlooks or deliberately ignores their flaws. In this process, the partner becomes a sacred figure, perceived as someone who compensates for the deficiencies in the individual's inner world. But here, love turns into a kind of mental projection rather than a genuine connection. A person seeks in their partner the perfection they cannot achieve themselves, and therefore wants the partner to be whole and flawless. Yet no one is perfect, and over time, this idealized image begins to collapse. This pursuit of perfection is directly related to a person's perception shaped in childhood. Individuals who idealized a parent or a role model during childhood often experience love in a similar pattern in adulthood. For example, if a child sees one of their parents as great, powerful, and capable of overcoming anything, they may later look for a similar figure in their personal life. They develop a subconscious belief that their partner should be ideal and make choices accordingly. However, this complicates the development of healthy relationships, as true love requires accepting flaws and loving a person as they are. Another aspect of the idealization process is that love is perceived as an experience filled with intense emotion. A person begins to see not only the physical or character traits of their beloved, but also a means of spiritual fulfillment. That is why love can become not merely a romantic bond, but a spiritual quest. A person seeks inner peace, happiness, and life's meaning through their partner. However, this form of love is not sustainable, as the person becomes entirely dependent on an external source for their happiness. Once flaws in the partner are revealed or they fail to meet expectations, deep disappointment sets in. At that point, love may suddenly end because the idealization mechanism has collapsed and the real person has emerged. The pursuit of perfection reflects an attempt to avoid one's inner shortcomings, and people often want to maintain this illusion. Yet real love is not born from seeing someone as perfect, but from accepting them in all their aspects. People don't simply fall in love with someone more often. They fall in love with an ideal image they've created in their subconscious. When this idealized love eventually meets reality, difficulties arise, and the nature of the relationship changes. But from Jung's perspective, the true meaning of love emerges when we stop seeing the other person as a projection of our inner world and instead accept them in their full reality. At that moment, love ceases to be a pursuit of an end goal and becomes a journey that helps the individual realize their true self. Now let us explain the second fundamental reason. Paradise, the desire for the familiar, archetypes, and subconscious modeling. We will examine this primary reason by dividing it into 4 sections. 201. The role of archetypes and their place in human psychology. According to Carl Jung, archetypes are fundamental building blocks of human psychology and represent universal images or patterns that arise from the depths of the unconscious. Jung defines archetypes as fundamental forms of human experience that are historically and culturally universal and reside within the collective unconscious of the individual. These archetypes have manifested in similar forms throughout human history, from the past to the present, shaping the inner world of people. Archetypes influence not only individual life experiences but also the structures of societies and cultures. These universal images act as a kind of blueprint deep within human psychology. They represent hidden patterns that guide people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, as well as enable them to connect with their conscious and unconscious processes. The place of archetypes in a person's inner world is very deep due to their connection with both conscious and unconscious processes. According to Jung, these archetypes symbolize important figures and events in a person's life. Every individual interacts with these universal archetypes to develop inner understanding and uncover their own identity. Jung believed that human development becomes possible through the surfacing and integration of repressed and unconscious aspects, such as the shadow archetype. Archetypes help people understand the meaning of life, themselves, and their relationships with others. Each archetype provides a kind of guidance and directs the person on their inner journey. The role of archetypes in love and relationships. One of Jung's deepest and most significant contributions to theory is the idea that people seek in their partners the archetypes they subconsciously possess. According to Jung, these archetypal images play a major role when people choose whom to fall in love with. When selecting a beloved, each person pays attention not only to external attractiveness, but also to archetypal characteristics that complement the missing or incomplete aspects of their unconscious. People unconsciously turn to archetypal figures to fill in the aspects of their personality they lack, regain lost self-confidence, or heal emotional wounds from the past. Therefore, if the person one falls in love with corresponds to the archetypal images in their unconscious, that person becomes extremely attractive and desirable. The place of archetypes in human psychology is one of the cornerstones of Jung's theory. Archetypes are structures that occupy a universal place in the unconscious and guide a person's inner world, shaping their thoughts and behavior. Archetypal images also play a significant role in people's relationships and love life. People subconsciously seek archetypal figures in their partners that will complete their missing or unfinished aspects, and these figures symbolize their emotional needs. However, under the influence of archetypes and projections, people sometimes idealize the person they love and see in them reflections of their inner desires rather than who they really are. Therefore, according to Jung, love can become healthy only through awareness and a deep connection with the real person. A guide to the unconscious attraction to the familiar. According to Carl Jung's theories, the human unconscious is a deep structure largely shaped by past experiences, social patterns, and internal archetypes. This unconscious carries not only individual memories but also universal symbols and the collective experience of human history. Even if people are unaware of it, unconscious patterns constantly influence and guide their lives. One such interaction is directly connected to how love and attraction develop between people. According to Jung, people are drawn to things that make them feel familiar and safe. The attraction to the familiar is guided by the unconscious, and people try to establish connections both with their inner world and their relationships, uncovering these deep links in their unconscious. The influence of the unconscious plays a significant role in how a person perceives the external world. People form a certain emotional subconscious structure shaped by experiences from childhood and early life. These structures determine how a person views the world, approaches relationships, and with whom they want to be close. The search for love and care in childhood leads a person to subconsciously seek reliable attachments and familiar figures. In later years, Jung's concept of the shadow also holds an important place here. Sometimes people project onto others emotional needs, fears, or shortcomings of which they themselves are unaware. These projections are similar to the pull toward familiar figures. In the subconscious, a person may project these aspects onto their partner to compensate for his or her unconscious emotional deficiencies, making that partner more attractive and familiar. Various myths, legends, and cultural symbols throughout human history support archetypes, and people establish an internal connection with these social patterns. For example, when men are portrayed in society as strong, leading, and protective figures, this can lead people to subconsciously gravitate towards such figures. Similarly, in the collective unconscious of society, there exist images of nurturing and protective mothers for women. These social archetypes influence an individual's partner choice. People are drawn to familiar figures defined by society and culture because these figures give them a sense of belonging, safety, and recognition. The attraction to these familiar figures on a subconscious level often reflects a person's emotional and psychological needs. People tend to gravitate toward figures that evoke feelings of peace and security. This attraction may be based solely on past experience, or be a consequence of the collective unconscious. For this process to function healthily, Jung recommends that people become aware of their inner world, recognize the projections of the unconscious, and accept these projections. Otherwise, attraction to partners aimed at compensating for unconscious deficiencies may lead to idealization and misleading projections. This can bring false expectations and disappointments into relationships. The attractiveness of the familiar, driven by the unconscious, profoundly affects how people form love and relationships. People are drawn to familiar archetypal figures to fill gaps in the subconscious, fill emotional voids, and create a safe space. A familiar figure combined with trust and a sense of belonging creates a bond that people feel deep within but do not consciously recognize. However, this bond can only be established on a healthy basis if the person becomes aware of the projections in their subconscious and builds healthy relationships. Toyati tracks reflection on the desire for the familiar in relationships. According to Carl Jung, love and relationships are not merely the result of external interactions, but also a reflection of deep psychological processes. The way people choose their partners is shaped by a strong attraction to archetypal figures within their subconscious. The desire for something familiar often reflects a person's search for subconscious needs that can be fulfilled within a relationship. However, this process can also lead to complex and sometimes problematic dynamics. The attraction to the familiar in the subconscious is often based on a person's childhood experiences and early attachments. In childhood, people frequently develop a sense of emotional security and belonging through relationships with mothers, fathers, or caregivers. These early attachments leave indelible marks in a person's subconscious. A person may subconsciously desire to compensate for the deficiencies and emotional wounds experienced during that period through their partner in a relationship. The desire for something familiar sometimes leads people to idealize their relationships. When people seek partners who will fill the gaps they subconsciously feel, they may develop the belief that these partners are perfect. The attraction to the familiar can also cause people to relive the pain they experienced in past relationships. Jung argues that people tend to re-experience unresolved emotional issues in the subconscious. To cope with them, this can be described as repetitive behavior or karma repetition. If people still carry unresolved trauma or emotional emptiness from past relationships in their subconscious, they may seek a partner with whom they can experience these deficiencies again. In this way, the desire for the familiar is actually a desire to experience something once more. It can also be viewed as an attempt by people to resolve emotional upheavals from their past relationships. One of the most important manifestations of the longing for the familiar in relationships is the strong emotional bond people develop with their partners. This bond is formed not only by physical attraction, but also by the desire to establish a deep connection on an emotional and psychological level. When people look for a partner who will fill their unconscious shortcomings, they are actually trying to find their own identity. This process is linked to the archetypes of anima and animus. Jung asserts that the figures of anima and animus are important psychological archetypes that shape a person's relationship with the opposite sex. The anima represents the feminine side of a man, while the animus represents the masculine side of a woman. These figures enable a person to strive for familiar relationships with the opposite sex. Unconscious idealization of the anima or animus figures can lead to the formation of strong emotional bonds in relationships. The longing for the familiar is formed both as a desire to establish a deep connection in relationships and as a desire to fill people's unconscious deficiencies. In this search, which relies on past experience, childhood bonds, and social archetypes, people are drawn to familiar figures in their partners. However, this process can also encounter issues such as idealization, projection, and the persistence of past imprints. According to Jung, healthy relationships must be based on awareness of these unconscious influences and on a connection with the true personality of the partner. Attraction to the familiar can foster the development of relationships on a deep and meaningful level, but it is important for a person to consciously guide this attraction. Otherwise, relationships may remain confined to patterns created by the past, which can prevent people from forming genuine connections. Attachment to the familiar and psychological development. Carl Jung's psychological theories are of great significance for understanding how a person's inner world and subconscious shape their relationship with the external world. When people subconsciously strive for something familiar, this search represents not only an emotional and physical attraction, but also an important turning point in the psychological development of the personality. Attachment to the familiar reflects a person's desire for balance in their inner world, for completeness, and for psychological maturity. This attachment serves as a means of emotional satisfaction of unconscious deficiencies, wounds, or unresolved archetypal figures. However, this process not only encourages the search for emotional security, but also promotes personal growth and inner transformation. Attachment to familiar figures in the subconscious begins as a search for security. People perceive the bonds they form with their parents in childhood as a kind of basic sense of trust. They try to fill emotional gaps from the past by connecting with the familiar within their subconscious. Although at first glance this may seem like a simple reenactment, in reality, it is the beginning of a deep process of psychological development. By rediscovering familiar figures from their own past in their partner, a person gains the opportunity to heal emotional relationships with these figures. Attachment to the familiar allows a person to develop a more whole and mature identity. Attachment to the familiar also triggers the process of establishing balance in a person's inner world. By turning to familiar figures in their subconscious, people reveal their own shadows, that is, the suppressed aspects and parts of themselves they cannot accept. According to Jung, the shadow consists of those aspects of the personality that are consciously rejected or suppressed, and these aspects can hinder a person's psychological development. However, confronting these aspects, accepting them, and achieving inner wholeness are important parts of the path to maturity. Attachment to the familiar can help to understand and transform this shadow. Attachment to the familiar can also help people explore their personal boundaries and self-esteem. Jung's concept of self-respect implies that a person respects themselves and accepts their own inner worth. Attachment to familiar figures can sometimes lead a person to cross their boundaries and lose themselves in their partner's needs. However, this commitment also provides an opportunity to restore personal boundaries and increase self-esteem. A person can reconsider their relationship with their partner, taking into account their own boundaries and emotional needs. This process involves establishing a healthy relationship with the partner and learning how to be together without losing individuality. Strengthening the bond with a partner while simultaneously protecting one's own identity ensures that psychological development proceeds in a healthy way. Attachment to the familiar is an important opportunity for psychological development of the personality. This commitment can become a means of compensating for emotional deficits from the past, accepting the shadow, achieving inner balance, and restoring personal boundaries. However, at first, this process may be difficult and complex. According to Jung's theories, psychological development becomes possible when the individual confronts unconscious figures, accepts them, and integrates them. Attachment to the familiar plays a significant role in this process because it allows people to resolve deep attachments within their inner world and build a more whole self. In this video, we discussed the reasons why people fall in love with you from Carl Jung's perspective. We believe that, according to Jung, there can be different opinions about the reasons people fall in love with you. What do you think? Is it more related to personality, environmental factors, or something else? Share your ideas in the comments. Let's discuss. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like the video. Your opinion is very important to us. Thank you.